Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here after the early one-week break into 2023, and we're back for UFC Vegas 68, which of course features the 4 Road to UFC finals. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just a quick introduction to these Road to UFC finals that I've just spoken about, because I don't feel like they've got as much exposure as what they should have done, and I don't think they've had as much marketing behind them as they should have done as well. But basically, the UFC have ran tournaments in the lightweight, featherweight, bantamweight and flyweight divisions over in various Asian countries. So South Korea, China, we've got India, Indonesia, we've got Japan as well. So they've run the tournament across multiple different Asian countries. And a little bit like the Ultimate Fighter, if you win, you progress to the next stage. And in this event I believe was supposed to be in South Korea. I believe the reason why it wasn't is they were trying to secure the Korean Zombie to headline the event. Maybe the Korean Zombie wasn't available. But anyway, it's in Vegas and it's still got that Asian feel to it, including the start times for this event, by the way, which are absolutely horrific if you don't live over in Asia. So obviously in the UK, the US is what I'm talking about specifically for that, real bad start times. But this event still got that Asian feel, and that's why the Road to UFC finals have been put on this event. Like I said, it was supposed to be in South Korea, but now it's over in Vegas for this event. So again, we'll be covering those fights within the breakdowns and giving you insight to each fighter, and obviously the breakdowns and predictions for who I believe is going to win on a card headlined by the rebooking of Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivac. Again, Sergey Spivac, Derrick Lewis, if you remember, that fight was cancelled during the event just a few weeks ago, so the UFC really interested to rebook it, and we get to break that fight down again. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there will be a Base AI recap in our Base AI playlist on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365, and that was from the last event, the UFC 283 pay-per-view in Brazil, where Base AI hit 80% across the straight pick predictions, and that's not 80% on your standard 11 or 12 fight card. That's across 15 fights, 12 correct, 3 incorrect. We had a couple of real good gems in there as well. So if you're interested in the AI and the predictions from the algorithms, then make sure you go and check that breakdown video out. But now it's time for the breakdowns. That's why you're all here. Main event in the UFC heavyweight division, the rebooking of Derrick Lewis versus Sergey Spivac. Now, obviously, I broke this fight down just a few weeks ago when they were originally scheduled, and I picked Sergey Spivac to win, and, I am going to pick him reluctantly to win again here in this breakdown. But, man, the more I think of this fight, the less confident I am of Sergey Spivac. Spivac's got good wrestling. I really like the way he's improved over at Extreme Couture, who are a very wrestling-heavy gym, and it pretty much seems like Spivac knows his game plan, and he's a smart fighter due to that as well. When he is, or when he believes he might be at even a slight striking disadvantage, he's shooting takedowns. He's got a real good top game as well, good ground and pound, a good submission game. So he's got the exact style that you would imagine to be perfect to beat somebody like Derrick Lewis. The thing is with Derrick Lewis is he's faced wrestlers before, and he's faced real good grapplers before, and he does really well against them more often than not. And even though his jiu-jitsu isn't phenomenal, he's got that power and explosive nature to be able to get back up to his feet. And when you talk about power and explosion, the power that he's got in his hands, the knockout power, is legitimate. It was the closest to Francis Ngannou in the UFC. Francis Ngannou no longer with the UFC, so Derrick Lewis, I was going to say arguably is the most powerful puncher in the UFC now, but I don't think it's arguably. I think he is the most powerful puncher in the UFC. He's taken Ngannou's spot now. Ngannou's gone. And not only is it legit power, but also wrestlers that fight Derrick Lewis are a little bit hesitant to close the distance and take him down. You look at Curtis Blaydes, for example. Curtis Blaydes, one of the best wrestlers in the UFC heavyweight division, and he was very, very hesitant with Lewis. Admittedly, he was doing well on the feet striking with Lewis, so he probably thought, well, should I even risk shooting a takedown, even though that's his style? But then when he did eventually shoot a decent takedown where you think, right, okay, he's in on the hips, he gets knocked out with an uppercut, and deaded knocked out, not just hurt and had to be put out. Like, he was out cold. And the thing is with Spivac, I don't think Spivac can stand and strike with Lewis. I think if he does, I think Lewis is going to knock him out. You look what Lewis did against Chris Daukaus. Chris Daukaus is a fast mover for the heavyweight division. He's got decent boxing, and Lewis ended up putting him out. Spivac, like I said, Spivac's advantage here is the fact that he can wrestle, and he does tend to wrestle well, and he does have a real good top game in regards to securing a position, ground and pound. He can submit as well. So that's the reason why Spivac's favoured in this fight. That's the reason why I am going to stick with my original pick and pick him to win the fight. But it's not a confident pick because, like I said, Lewis can knock anybody out in just that flash moment, and I could go for days just talking about examples of that as well. But obviously, the examples are written there on paper, in history, on his record. And I've spoken about him a million times before. So Spivac technically does have that style to beat Derrick Lewis. He does have the ability to do it. He does seem to have a decent fight IQ in regards to when to shoot safely, and to make those top positions secure. Derrick Lewis has got every chance of knocking him out, but for the sake of the prediction, as I've already mentioned numerous times now, I am going to be picking Sergey Spivac to win this fight. And in the next fight, the co-main event, we've got Da Un Jung versus Devin Clark. Now, Devin Clark, predominantly a wrestler, but he does like to stand and strike, and he does like to throw hands, and he's an absolute gamer. We saw when his teeth were bent backwards a few fights ago. There's no quitting the dude, but this is absolutely a fight where he needs to get his wrestling going. Da Un Jung, a very tall, long, powerful, rangy striker, and I think the volume maybe with Da Un Jung is a little bit suspect, but outside of that, he's got good combinations. He's fast as well, and he's not one of these widely built light heavyweights. He's a light heavyweight that's athletically built, that's tall and long, and like I've already mentioned, and has got speed to his strikes as well, along with that deceptive power. He can switch stances. And like I said, I think if Devin Clark stands toe-to-toe with Da Un Jung, I think Da Un Jung's going to knock him out. Ultimately, I do think, spoiler alert, that is the likelihood of this fight and how it's going to play out. But Devin Clark's got to give himself a chance here. He's got to try and get to the legs of Da Un Jung and take him down. But I don't think Da Un Jung's going to be taken down easily. I think if he does get taken down, he's got a good enough defensive submission game but even offensive submission game to potentially lock onto a submission, use it to stand back up, get his striking going, get the fight back onto the feet out in open space. But aside from that defensive wrestling game that Da Un Jung can possess, I think that for Devin Clark, he's going to have the most issue closing the distance, because he's got to close the distance to get into the legs of Da Un Jung, or at least to the body, to start some wrestling going. And closing that distance on Da Un Jung is going to be really difficult because of the hand speed, because of the power that Jung possesses. Once Devin Clark does step into close range and feels the power of Da Un Jung, he could potentially then start looking a little bit hesitant of getting into close range because of that power, because now he's a little bit wary, and it's ultimately just going to make the job very difficult of Devin Clark moving forward. And if he doesn't get that wrestling going, if he does become hesitant closing the distance, it's just going to be a very, very long night for Devin Clark. And it's for those reasons I'm picking Da Un Jung to win this fight. And in the next fight in the UFC heavyweight division, we've got a real well-matched fight that should be really close, competitive. We've got Marcin Tybura versus Blagoy Ivanov. So between Tybura and Ivanov, they're both real low volume, more or less. The action in the fights can be a little hit and miss. It can be a little bit, I wouldn't say dull, but actionless, I think, is probably the right term to use. Slow pace, patient approach from both fighters. Both fighters have got a decent all-round game. Marcin Tybura, more of a kickboxing style on the feet striking, but then he will like to wrestle. He does like to grapple. He's got a decent top game. Blagoy Ivanov on the other side, more of a boxing heavy striking game, but then he's got this combat sambo background. He's got a black belt in judo. He's got good submissions. Again, a good top game once he gets on top of his opponent. So again, just from an all-round perspective, stylistic perspective, both fighters are really well matched, and it should make for a close fight. Now, the one thing that happens with both fighters, if they do both slow down, naturally in the heavyweight division it's going to happen as well, but I do feel that Tybura slows down a little bit more, so that is something that I would edge over to the side of Ivanov as well. And I also think that Tybura is definitely susceptible to being knocked out. Now, he did go through a phase a couple of years ago where he did get knocked out back to back, and he was looking very suspect from a durability perspective, but then he put together this run of fights and his durability didn't look so much of an issue, pretty much like how Andrei Arlovski went about things when he was getting knocked out and then suddenly he wasn't anymore. But I do still think that Tybura can be rocked. I do think he can be hurt, whereas Ivanov on the other side, and listen, this is why I'm just comparing both slight aspects to both of these fighters in this fight, because I do think it's genuinely close. But back onto the durability with Ivanov, this dude is borderline impossible to knock out. And of course, you can never say never, especially in the heavyweight division with 4-ounce gloves, like I say all the time. But Blagoy Ivanov has eaten the hardest shots from Derrick Lewis. He's eaten the hardest shots from Marcus Rogerio de Lima. He's eaten the hardest shots from Tai Tuivasa. And I'm not talking just one clean shot in each of those fights. Like the Derrick Lewis fight specifically was repeatedly hard shot after hard shot, eating combinations from Derrick Lewis. And he didn't even look phased. He didn't even look rocked or anywhere close to being knocked out. So for Marcin Tybura to come out here and knock him out would be, I think, a big surprise, even in the heavyweight division, even with those 4-ounce gloves. So, in my opinion, when you're looking at a close fight, especially in the heavyweight division, and you've got a fighter that's got slightly better cardio, insane durability, instantly I start leaning over to that fighter. However, the one thing that Tybura does have over Ivanov, in my opinion, is a slight volume edge. But then Ivanov hits hard, and if Tybura does get rocked a little bit, or he is wobbling and he is getting hit with hard shots and Ivanov is the one pushing forwards, then even if Tybura's got more volume, Ivanov's going to have the more judge-friendly style. So I think that it's going to be back and forth. I think it's going to be low volume. I think it's going to be relatively actionless, and I think because of that it is going to be a close fight and competitive fight, but with the very slight edges that I've mentioned in regards to cardio, durability, and the power on the shots as well, I am going to edge slightly towards the side of Ivanov. So I'm picking Blagoy Ivanov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the return of the Korean Superboy Do Ho Choi versus Kyle Nelson. Now, Do Ho Choi is a weird one because he came into the UFC with all this hype, 3-fight winning streak, and now, with that 3-fight winning streak, he was relatively young as well. Now he's 31, so he's edging towards the end of his prime. He's on a 3-fight losing streak, not fought for the last couple of years. I think he's finally completed his mandatory military service in South Korea, which is what I believe all South Korean men, I'm not sure about women, men definitely have to do as a South Korean-born person. So Do Ho Choi's completed that. He's back now. But again, like, I kind of feel like his career is, obviously he's not declining and it's not over yet. Like, he's probably going to be able to fight for another 4 or 5 years. But I think definitely the best part of his career is behind him. And at 31 on a 3-fight losing streak, there's some definite question marks on Do Ho Choi. And not just because of that losing streak and not just because of the age either, but with how those fights have gone down. Like, Charles Jourdain knocked him out. The fight before that, it was Jeremy Stephens who knocked him out. The fight before that, it was Cub Swanson that absolutely blitzed him in one of the best fights that we've ever seen in a 3-round war. Now, you can make the argument that Cub Swanson was absolutely a top fighter in his prime at that point. Jeremy Stephens was a top fighter in his prime at that point. Charles Jourdain is still a very, very good fighter, a dangerous fighter, and probably a fighter that Do Ho Choi didn't know too much about at the time, would know more about him now if he fought him. So, you've got those counter arguments to that. Now, with Kyle Nelson, originally I thought, okay, well, the UFC are actually putting Do Ho Choi in against a fighter that is going to get Do Ho Choi back in the win column, and I still do believe that to an extent. But actually, when you watch tape on Kyle Nelson, it ain't going to be as easy as that. Kyle Nelson is a big, strong, powerful fighter in this division. He's a fighter that sure, has only won one in his last 5, but like he's put on some good performances against Billy Quarantillo. He looked good against Jai Herbert. He looked good early in the fight, and in both of those fights maintained some form of competitiveness for as long as the fights went on. So the fact that he's competing well with the likes of Billy Quarantillo and the likes of Jai Herbert, 2 fighters I think quite highly of, tells me that he's actually going to be able to hang with good quality fighters, and Duo Choi is a good quality fighter. Duo Choi will put together combinations. He'll mix kicks to the leg of his opponent. He'll throw kicks to the body. He'll put together nice combinations with his hands. He's got a good lead up, a good stepping uppercut with his backhand. So Kyle Nelson's definitely gonna have some work to do in this fight, and I do think that Duo Choi, should he not get knocked out, will be able to do good work on Kyle Nelson for the majority of the fight. Maybe even find a finish late. But if he doesn't and it goes to a decision, I think Duo Choi can put together a good volume-based, combination-based attack where he is looking good against Kyle Nelson. But I don't think it's like the cut-and-dry fight that most people will assume that it's going to be, and just automatically think, oh, well, Kyle Nelson's some can that the UFC are just throwing to Duo Choi to get Duo Choi back in the win column. I don't think it's like that at all. I think Kyle Nelson is absolutely going to hold his own in this fight. I just don't know if he's going to be able to keep up with the volume, the speed, and the combinations of Choi, which is the reason why I think Kyle Nelson will fall short. But I think he'll fall short in a fight that's close and competitive. And even if there is a finish, I think all the work prior to that finish will be, again, close and competitive from both fighters. So I do think Nelson's going to fall short. I do think the combinations of Choi, I think the speed of Choi, the pressure of Choi should be enough to get him over the line in this fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Duo Choi to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got the newcomer Yusaku Kinoshita versus Adam Fugitt. And I think that this is going to be quite a wild fight. Like, Adam Fugitt comes down into the cage, he comes to fight, he's a gamer, he'll throw combinations with his hands, power, he'll put kicks in with his combinations as well, and Kinoshita's a fighter that loves to move forward. I think he's more technically sound than Fugitt. I think that he's a fighter that will put things together a little bit more cleaner than Fugitt as well, but he's just got to mind his P's and Q's, because Fugitt is going to be here to scrap, like, for sure, and he will put a good performance on against Kinoshita. But I do think that Fugitt's hittable as well, and this is the other thing. For as wild as he is, he does leave openings for his opponents. I think Kinoshita's a fighter that is going to be able to, maybe not initially, but once he gets his reads down, he's going to be able to find those openings, find those holes in the game of Fugitt, and start to push that pace, put the pressure on him, and start to really take over the fight the longer it goes on. But I think definitely in the early moments, there's going to be some fireworks in this fight. I think it's going to be explosive. Both fighters are just going to be teeing off on each other. But like I said, when push comes to shove and the fight starts to slow down from those initial explosive moments, it's going to be the fighter that is more technically sound. It's going to be the fighter that is starting to make the reads. It's going to be the fighter that's starting to pick his shots because of the reads, because of the technical ability, that's going to end up going on to win the fight, whether it be a finish later in the fight or whether it be a decision. And I just think Kinoshita is that more technical fighter, is the fighter with that higher level of fight IQ, is the fighter that's more likely to make the reads. I think Fugitt's a fighter that's going to want to be active and explosive for as long as the fight goes on, and will constantly keep coming forwards with the big bombs, looking to take Kinoshita out of there. And like I said, I think the longer the fight goes on, when everything starts slowing down, when both fighters have fatigue starting to set in, I think it's, again, the technical fighter that's going to be making the reads, that's going to be able to drag himself across the line. And for those reasons, I'm picking Yusaku Kinoshita to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a road to UFC final in the lightweight division. We've got Anshul Jubli versus Jeka Saragih. Now, Jeka Saragih is one of 2 fighters specifically in these road to UFC finals that I'm really, really looking forward to and excited to see. And I think Saragih could potentially be an instant fan favourite once fans start seeing how he fights and his style and how he approaches his fights as well. He's a very short but explosive striker. He's got a decent wrestling game. He's got a decent grappling game as well, but on the feet is where he really loves to stand and bang. And he's actually a real strange striker in regards to he will occasionally just look over his shoulder, look at where the cage wall is, and set himself back against that cage to allow his opponents to come forward on him, and then he'll burst forwards with the explosive combinations looking to take them out. And the reason that's strange is because most fighters like to forward pressure their opponents, to put their opponents as back against the cage and be in that position. Saragih's just a little bit unorthodox in his striking. Now, with Anshul Jubli, he's actually a good fighter as well. So when you watch him on the regional scene, definitely looks more like a wrestler, grappler type of fighter. He'll come in, he will stand and strike, he's tall, he's long, and he will look for takedowns. Once he gets his opponents down, he seems to have a good topside grappling game. The only question mark I've got with Jubli is when he came into the road to UFC. I believe that he was a short notice replacement as well, because he only had the one road to UFC fight, whereas the other finalists have had two. So I think he came in sort of midway. Again, like I said in the introduction, there's not been a lot of exposure from the UFC to the road to UFC, so I'm not 100% sure on the ins and outs with that. But in his fight, in his one fight prior to this in road to UFC, he didn't look to wrestle and grapple at all. I think he shot maybe one or two takedowns, but they weren't convincing takedowns, and he definitely looked like he was a striker. And if you watch his fights out of chronological order, so you watch that fight first, you would think he was a striker and then be surprised of what you see when you go further back. So it just begs the question, this guy has been fighting on the Indian scene, Indian MMA scene as well. And listen, what I'm about to say, there's no disrespect to Indian MMA, and the UK MMA scene is also not great either. But the Indian MMA regional scene is one of the most criticised MMA regional scenes globally for, you know, some of the things that happen, things being a little bit sketchy, results being a little bit not what you think they should be, shall we say. And listen, you can find out more about it with a Google search, but when you're looking at a fighter on the Indian regional scene that's looking like a solid wrestler, a solid grappler, and then they step on the biggest stage, you would assume that they're going to use that style that got them to where they are in that, under that UFC banner, in road to UFC at that big stage, but he didn't. And he wasn't really against a fighter that was a serious wrestler or grappler himself. You know, he was a striker and he decided to stand with him. So I do question where Jubli's game plan is going to be in this fight, but for Saragih, I think Saragih is going to have a lot of success actually landing on Jubli, because Jubli's actually a good striker as well, and he did showcase that in his last fight in the road to UFC. He's long, he's got straight sniper punches, he'll come in the pocket, he'll land combinations, he'll go to the body, he'll mix in kicks as well. But the thing is, he's got that tall man defense where he'll step back with his chin up in the air, step back in straight lines, doesn't move his head off a center line, and someone like Saragih is going to be able to land on Jubli often. And this is where the biggest problem comes in my opinion, because Saragih, you go back and watch his fights and this dude drops pretty much everybody that he fights. Even in his last fight, I'm pretty confident, again, I haven't seen any odds, but I'm pretty confident that Won Bin Ki, who Saragih knocked out in round one the last time out, he was a big lightweight. He was an experienced lightweight. He was a protege under the Korean Zombie, Chang Sung Jung, at Korean Zombie MMA. And I'm pretty sure Won Bin Ki was going to be the favourite, or at least the UFC thought he was going to be the favourite to win this lightweight tournament at road to UFC. And Saragih went out there, looked great in the early moments, and just sparked him out cold in that first round. And again, gave up a lot of height, gave up a lot of reach, gave up a lot of size. So I think that if Jubli comes in this fight and starts to wrestle and grapple, I think that's where he's going to have the most success. But Jeka Saragih is a decent wrestler and grappler himself, and on the feet, I think Saragih is just going to be able to find the home often with his strikes, with his combinations, with the bursts of explosions, with Jubli's tall man defense, and with Saragih's, you know, record of dropping fighters and knocking them out cold. I just have to have concerns, big concerns for Jubli with that striking defense. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jeka Saragih to win this fight and become the road to UFC lightweight winner. And in the next fight, this is the road to UFC featherweight final. We've got Yija versus Jeong Lee. And I think this is probably going to be the best fight out of the four finals here. I think Yija and Jeong Lee match up really well. I think they're both fast. I think they're both physical, They've both got a real good skill set. Yizha, I think, is more well-rounded because although he can strike, I think his grappling game is really good. His grappling game is probably slightly better than his striking game. His wrestling game, it'll be more body lock takedowns from the clinch opposed to your traditional single legs and double legs. But I think that Yizha is the more well-rounded fighter in this fight. However, what Zhonglong Lee brings to the table is he brings absolute power, this deceptive power, the touch of death type of power, which you don't often see in the featherweight division. It's normally divisions with the higher weights that you see that touch of death. For example, I've said it a million times with Jairzinho Rosenstruik at heavyweight, that type of touch of death. But Zhongyong Lee, man, he absolutely has power. He deads his opponents. He knocks them out cold. You really cannot get hit too cleanly by Lee, especially early on in the fight. Where you can seem to get Zhongyong Lee is when you extend him a little bit, take him later in the fight, not get into these crazy exchanges when he's fresh and when both fighters have got the most cardio, the most power. And I think if Yizha, his game plan comes into this fight and he wants to wrestle and grapple with Zhongyong Lee, I think that's going to be his best path to victory, just to take away that power in the first round and see what happens later in the fight. But what comes with a problem with trying to wrestle and grapple Lee is if you take Lee down, he's got a super fast armbar, like a real quick armbar snap on where he will lock up that arm and instantly get the tap. So I think that, like I said, this is my favourite fight of the entire road to UFC finals. I do think that Lee is going to be able to find something early on, though. Like Yizha, I do like him as a fighter, but I think in the early moments where he's making his reads, that's where it's going to be the most dangerous, and I think that's where Lee's going to come across and find something. And if he doesn't and the fight does get extended, I do think Lee's going to win that first round while they're fresh. Maybe Yizha takes a round later in the fight with the wrestling and topside grappling, but then Lee's not a slouch when it comes to the grappling either, and on the feet I think that Zha's going to be okay, but Lee's just going to have the edge. So I feel like the wrestling and grappling is going to be really close. I think the striking could be close, but I do think that Lee, with that power advantage, I do think he's slightly more diverse as well in regards to the variety of strikes that he throws. So that's why I think that the edge is on Lee to win this fight. For those reasons, I'm picking Zhongyong Lee to win this fight and become the road to UFC featherweight winner. And in the next fight, we're staying with the road to UFC, this time the bantamweight final. We've got Rinya Nakamura versus Toshiomi Kazama. Now, Rinya Nakamura, the first thing I noticed is his topology picture. I won't spoil it. If anybody wants to go and see, you'll instantly know his style before you even watch any tape on him. It's one of those really funny topology pictures that just pretty much gives your entire background away just in one image. Rinya Nakamura, absolutely a wrestler, wrestling background, freestyle wrestling background as well. So he's going to fit the bill well in the UFC and is a real big favourite in this fight, and I think is a real big favourite for a reason. He's one of these wrestlers that is a strong wrestler, but then he's also starting to pick up his hands a little bit. He's got heavy hands, so not only has he got heavy hands, he's got the ability to drop his opponents, knock them out, but if he doesn't knock them out, and he just hits them hard, it's going to allow him to move forwards because his opponent isn't going to move forwards after one of his big bombs. And once Nakamura's moving forwards, that's going to allow him to really get his wrestling game going, which is where his bread and butter is. Over on the other side of the cage with Kazama looks to be more of a grappler, forward pressure, looks to get close to his opponents, body lock, take them down. If he is taken down, he can guard play a little bit, which again is a reason why Nakamura, if he does get him down, I do worry for Kazama a lot. But what makes me more worried for Kazama is his game is to get close to his opponents, get a hold of them and take them down and look to really do good work on top of them. So his game is going to be to close the distance on the wrestler, which is going to do the work for Nakamura. If Nakamura wants to, not expend as much energy, Kazama, his game will be to work to the game of Nakamura. So I think both fighters are going to be working within their games and where their style predominantly is. And I just think Nakamura is going to come out better of that. The better wrestler in those situations is going to be the one that takes his opponent down. Now, Nakamura does have to mind his P's and Q's, of course. Kazama can with him guard playing, he's going to be confident in his submissions off his back. So Nakamura, again, has got to just, like I've said, mind his P's and Q's there. But outside of that, I think Nakamura is going to be the one that's going to be offensive with the wrestling. I think he's going to be able to stay out the way of the defensive submission attempts from Kazama off his back. And I think Kazama's going to give up quite a lot of top control time as well. Maybe the longer the fight goes on, he tires. Maybe Nakamura finds a finish on the mat with a tired Kazama underneath him, with him having his morale broken by being constantly taken down and having so much time conceded with top control time. Maybe he does break him down and find a finish, but if he doesn't, I think it should be a relatively comfortable decision and a somewhat comfortable fight for Nakamura. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rinya Nakamura to win this fight and, of course, win the road to UFC Bantamweight tournament. And now we move on to the final road to UFC final. This time in the Flyweight division, we've got Hyun Park versus Sun Guk Choi. Now, I think the first round of this fight is going to be super fun. I think Park and Choi are both going to meet in the middle. I think they're both going to throw down. They've both got well-rounded games as well, so they will both... I think it's more Choi that's going to look for the wrestling, but Park can wrestle, and I think Park's probably the slightly better developed grappler with the more solid positioning as well when it comes to that BJJ. But Choi's definitely got an ability to grapple on top. It's just, I think if Choi gets on top of Park, I think Park is the more likely to maybe sweep reverse or find it easier to get back up to the feet, opposed to if it was Park on top of Choi. I think Choi would be a little bit more stuck. Not that, again, Park's some beast wrestler that will be able to keep Choi on his back for long periods of time, but I think when it comes to the wrestling and grappling, well, the wrestling will obviously lead to grappling, and I think the grappling of Park is going to be better than Choi. I think Choi's wrestling is going to be better, so probably not the best game plan for Choi to wrestle heavily in this fight because of that, even though he has an advantage there. But on the feet, both fighters are fast. They've both got good strikes. I think they've both got good combinations as well. The problem that I've got with Choi is a fighter out of the Korean Zombie MMA, so you can imagine that he's a well put together fighter, which he is. The issue that I've got with Choi is his first round is always his best. The second round he slows down a little bit. The third round he slows down a little bit more, which you can make the argument that that's normal for a fighter because, you know, you're always going to be at your peak in regards to your gas tank and cardio in round one, but he slows down significantly to the point where the third round is always a coin flip round, even if he's better than his opponent, even if he's battered his opponent round 1 and 2, his opponent seems to always have a good third round. And I think with Hyun Park, he's a fighter that, again, of course, he'll naturally slow down the longer the fights go on. He's only human, but I think that if this fight does make it to the third round, I would more or less say that Park's going to win that third round because of the cardio of Choi. And listen, Choi doesn't gas out to the point where his hands are on his knees and he can't breathe or anything like that. It's just his hands come a little bit low. He's visibly tired, breathing out of his mouth. He becomes hittable. And I think someone like Park will really take advantage of that, which means that Park would only have to win one of the first 2 rounds. And considering that Park, his striking is going to be very close to the striking of Choi's, and I don't think there's going to be too much between it early in that first round, that round could be a coin flip. But then I think Park's got the advantage in round 2 when Choi's starting the slowdown process. And then I think Park's got a real good chance of winning round 3 should it get there as well. And then, like I say, you go back to that first round coin flip, you know, you might even be looking at a 30-27 to Park across the board, which I think is the reason why he's a higher favourite than what I thought he would be initially. But then when you real dig deep into the fight, you can sort of see why the betting lines are where they're at. And if there is a finish in this fight, I think that Park's the more likely to finish from a submission perspective. I think from a striking perspective, it's very close. Maybe you'd give an edge to Park there as well with slightly more power on the feet. But again, I'm clutching at straws. From a finishing edge, though, across the striking and grappling, I would definitely say that it's slightly towards Park. And then, like I've already mentioned with the point scoring side, if it goes to a decision, I think that Park's got the advantage there because of how Choi slows down. So for those reasons, I'm picking Hyun Park to win this fight and become the road to UFC Flyweight winner. And in the next fight, we've got Jeong Kim versus Mandy Bohm. So back to fighters that we should be familiar with within the UFC, but 2 fighters I've not really been over impressed with, if I'm being honest. I think that both fighters have got an okay skill set. You know, I'm not shitting on any of the fighters. It's just I feel like some of the fights have been a little bit underwhelming, and I think that it's one of those where both fighters could have maybe given a little bit more, considering that they have good skill sets as well. I think Jeong Kim, though, here is the fighter that's going to likely take it to Mandy Bohm a little bit more, and maybe not from the aggressive perspective, because I do think Mandy Bohm should be the aggressor in this fight and moving forward, but I think that Jeong Kim does a good job counter-striking. I think she can do a better job moving backwards than what Mandy Bohm can. So again, if both women are exchanging forward pressure and, the backward steps, I think that Jeong Kim's going to do better from that perspective, because I think that she can fight better on the back foot than what Mandy Bohm can. So I think that, again, unless Mandy Bohm really comes into this fight and starts mixing up some wrestling and grappling and gets on top of Kim, which I don't necessarily think that she's going to, I think that's where Mandy Bohm might be able to take Jeong Kim out of a flow state that I feel like she's going to get in, and that's key here. I think that if this fight does go to a decision, which I do anticipate it does, I don't think there's going to be a finish here, but if it does go to a decision, I think that the majority of the fight, or the better work on the fight, is going to play out on the feet, and I think that Kim's just that slightly more technical fighter with slightly better volume and will be slightly more active throughout the 3 rounds. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick Jeong Kim to win this fight. And in the next fight, the Iron Turtle, Jun Yong Park versus Dennis Tululan. I think Dennis Tululan's going to be a dangerous fighter in this fight early on for Park, but you can pretty much say that about every Dennis Tululan fight. Like, Dennis Tululan will bring it to his opponents early in the fight. He's powerful, he's aggressive, he'll look to take your chin off and into row Z, as I normally like to say. So Jung Yong Park has definitely got to manage things very carefully early in this fight, especially throughout all of round 1. The thing is with Jung Yong Park, he's got that ability to really stop that aggression and really stop that power just by shooting in, taking Dennis Tululan down. Listen, Dennis Tululan's not going to be easy to take down, but Jung Yong Park's got a way of wrestling relatively well, in my opinion. I don't think he's like a beast wrestler, but he's definitely one of these fighters that was a striker coming into the UFC, and then in his MMA gym, he's really worked hard on his MMA wrestling, so he hasn't got that wrestling background, but he's very fluent within MMA wrestling, and because of that, he's able to get takedowns in MMA, believe it or not. And I do think he does a good job of that. I think in this fight, as long as he just covers up early on, doesn't get hit with anything too hard, and just gets a hold of Tululan, I think Jun Yong Park's got decent cardio as well. I think even if he doesn't take him down, he just tries to hold him against the cage and just drain some of that energy from Tululan. It'll help Jun Yong Park later down the line. And if Jun Yong Park does get on top of Dennis Tululan, like, don't be surprised if there's a finish there either, because Jun Yong Park, again, is not got the craziest ground and pound, but he can submit. And like I say, he does a good job. And I think Dennis Tululan, once he is taken down and flattened on his back, I think that's where he will have problems potentially defending or being able to get back up to his feet. It's just the initial scramble within the takedown. Dennis Tululan does a good job of using his strength and keeping himself vertical. But also, Jung Yong Park's dealt with these powerful fighters before and has done a good job before of dealing with aggression, forward pressure, and a fighter that likes to get in your face. So I think that Jung Yong Park has got the UFC experience and has fought fighters like this to be able to, again, just have a good idea of how to handle another fighter like this. If he doesn't get finished in the first round, then Jun Yong Park should absolutely be the favourite moving forwards after that point, and I think that's exactly what happens. I think Dennis Tululan will have his moments. I think it might be a little bit sweaty if you're betting on Jun Yong Park, but after those initial early moments, maybe the first 2.5 minutes later into round 1, I think Jun Yong Park will start to look okay and start to really come back into this fight with a slightly tired Dennis Tululan. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jun Yong Park to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this episode of the podcast, we've got Tatsuro Taira versus Jesus Aguilar, the newcomer. And I think it's going to be a pretty hard debut for Jesus Aguilar in this fight. You know, making his UFC debut against somebody like Tatsuro Taira, who came in with the UFC. I'm not sure with too much hype. I hyped him up quite a bit. You know, when I saw him on the regional scene, once he'd got signed to the UFC, I'm not going to pretend that I've known this guy and followed him for years, because I haven't. But when he was scheduled to make his UFC debut, and I went back and watched his regional scene fights. Man, like, this dude is good, and he's shown it in the UFC as well. There's a reason why he's a -1,000 to -1,200 favourite in this fight. Easily the biggest favourite on the card. I think probably the biggest favourite of the year so far, and I think a fighter will do well to out-favourite Tatsuro Taira in this spot as well. There's a reason for it. Listen, Jesus Aguilar is actually not a bad fighter, and I can see him getting wins in the UFC for sure. I can see him being a fan favourite as well. The dude's short, stocky, he's aggressive, he comes forward, he'll throw big bombs. He's got decent wrestling. The problem with what I've seen of his grappling, though, is he can leave holes for him to be swept and reversed, which isn't great. But from a stocky, wide, powerful fighter perspective, like, the dude throws bombs, he can take a shot as well, and he's game. He's a game fighter and will eat 2 or 3 if it means landing 3 or 4 himself. So I think that Jesus Aguilar is a fighter that is going to be okay. After this fight, I think he is going to find wins in the UFC, but in this fight in particular, I think he's just outgunned. I think he's going to be outgunned on the feet by the taller, longer Taira, who's going to have a massive speed advantage, in my opinion, as well. Aguilar's going to be the one that has the power advantage, so that's going to be the edge that Aguilar has here. But as I've just said, Taira's going to be the taller, longer, faster striker, the quicker mover, the more elusive mover. And then when the fight hits the mat, I think Taira's going to be the slightly better wrestler. Not too much the slightly better wrestler, but a slightly better wrestler nonetheless. Then when it hits the mat, I think Taira's absolutely the better grappler. And I think there's a big gap in skill there as well between both fighters. So I do struggle to see Taira lose this fight unless he just gets caught with a big bomb. But again, I've not really seen too much evidence that Taira's got the durability issues that I believe he would need to have to succumb to, getting finished by knockout, TKO in this fight. So listen, I think that I understand why Taira is a big favourite in this fight. I think he's a real prospect to keep an eye on. I think the UFC have given Aguilar a very tough fight for his UFC debut, and for all the reasons that I've mentioned during this breakdown, I'm picking Tatsuro Taira to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. Remember, if you're wanting to watch this event live, make sure you check your local listings of what time this event's on, because it isn't going to be a normal time. Again, outside of the UK and the US, wherever you're from, if you're from anywhere else, just like I say, just make sure you check wherever you normally watch the UFC to get the scheduled timings for the event. And if you are staying up to watch it, then more power to you. However, as always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to the breakdowns. If you're listening to this on a platform that allows you to comment, leave a comment, tell me who you're picking to win, tell me who you're betting. If you are betting, I hope you smash the bookies. I will try and get back to every possible reply that I can. It is me personally that gets back to the replies on this platform, on the channels, especially YouTube as well. So, as always, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next week.